Excuse me, sir,
Victoria Lane said, her voice sweet but laced with authority.
This is the first-class cabin. Coach is further down the aisle.
Dominic Hughes, the unassuming billionaire behind SkyLuxe Airlines, looked up from his seat, his expression calm yet curious. He didn't respond immediately, letting the weight of her assumption linger in the air.
I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be,
he replied evenly, holding up his ticket for her to see. Victoria's eyes flicked to the ticket, her perfectly arched brow raising slightly as she scrutinized it. Her lips tightened into a line.
Let me verify this with the gate agent,
she said sharply, snatching the ticket and marching off. The cabin grew quiet as nearby passengers exchanged curious glances. Dominic remained seated, his posture calm, exuding the quiet strength of someone used to navigating storms. When Victoria returned moments later, her face was flushed, her professional mask slipping.
Your ticket checks out,
she admitted reluctantly, but her tone still carried a bite.
But I'm sure there's been some mistake. Passengers in this cabin are expected to meet certain standards.
Dominic stood, adjusting his blazer.
I assure you,
he said calmly.
I exceed every standard.
Her frustration boiled over.
You're disrupting first class with your attitude,
she snapped, her voice rising.
A scene?
Dominic asked, raising an eyebrow.
I've barely said a word.
And then it happened. In a moment of rage, Victoria slapped him. The sharp crack of her palm echoed through the cabin, followed by a collective gasp. Passengers froze, their wide eyes darting between the two figures at the center of the storm. Dominic turned his head back slowly, his cheek reddened but his composure unshaken. His voice, when it came, was low and steady.
You just made the biggest mistake of your career.
How would you feel if someone judged you without knowing who you are? Have you ever experienced a moment where someone underestimated you? This is a story of resilience, redemption, and powerful change. It's about how one man used an act of injustice to spark transformation, not just for himself, but for an entire company. If this story inspires you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We love hearing from you. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Let's spark conversations about kindness, humility, and the strength to make a difference. Now, let's dive into the story that will leave you inspired and thinking differently about second chances. Dominic Hughes stepped into the first-class cabin of SkyLuxe Airlines with the quiet confidence of a man who had navigated far greater challenges than air travel. Dressed in a simple gray blazer, dark jeans, and well-worn loafers, he looked more like a retired professor than the billionaire founder of the airline itself. This was intentional. Dominic had long learned that wealth and power were best wielded subtly, with actions rather than appearances. The cabin exuded luxury, buttery leather seats, soft lighting, and the faint hum of an expertly curated playlist. To Dominic, it was a familiar space, the culmination of years of hard work and a dream born out of his mother's sacrifices. Yet, to the passengers and staff who caught glimpses of him as he moved down the aisle, he seemed out of place. "Excuse me, sir," came a voice, smooth but commanding. Dominic turned to see Victoria Lane, the chief flight attendant. She was strikingly beautiful, with perfectly styled hair, an immaculate uniform, and an aura of authority sharpened by years of catering to the elite. Her polite smile did little to hide the judgment in her eyes. "This is the first-class cabin. Coach is further down the aisle," she said, gesturing with a manicured hand. Dominic studied her for a moment before offering a calm smile. "I'm aware," he replied evenly, holding up his boarding pass. Victoria's eyes flicked to the ticket, her brow furrowing slightly. Something about him didn't sit right with her. His casual attire, the quiet confidence, it all felt incongruous with the image she had of a first-class passenger. "Let me verify this," she said curtly, taking the ticket and striding toward the galley. Dominic sighed as he settled into his seat, feeling the weight of several curious glances from the other passengers. He was no stranger to this. Being underestimated based on appearance was a recurring theme in his life. He leaned back as recalling his mother's voice. "Dom, when the world underestimates you, don't fight it, let them, then show them what you're made of." Minutes passed before Victoria returned, her expression tight. "Your ticket checks out," she admitted, her tone clipped. But instead of stepping away, she lingered, her eyes scanning him again, this time with open skepticism. "I'm sure there's been some mistake," she said, folding her arms. Passengers in first class are expected to meet certain standards. Dominic's gaze didn't waver. And what standards might those be? He asked calmly, though the tension in his voice was unmistakable. Victoria faltered slightly but pressed on. We prioritize an image of sophistication in this cabin. It's important for our brand. The murmurs around them grew louder. A man seated across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, while a woman whispered to her companion, glancing at Dominic. I see, Dominic said quietly, his voice steady. Well, I assure you, I exceed every standard you could possibly imagine. Victoria's face flushed. She took a step closer, lowering her voice. Sir, if you insist on disrupting the atmosphere, I'll have to ask you to leave the cabin. Dominic tilted his head, his expression unchanged. Disrupting? He repeated. I've barely said a word. At that, Victoria's composure cracked. This is unacceptable, she hissed. Her voice, though subdued, carried enough edge to silence the nearby whispers. Stop making a scene. A scene? Dominic asked, raising an eyebrow. I think that's your doing, not mine. And then it happened. In a moment of unrestrained frustration, Victoria raised her hand and slapped him across the face. The sharp crack of the impact echoed through the cabin, freezing everyone in their seats. Dominic's head turned slightly from the force of the blow. For a moment, he stayed perfectly still, letting the silence stretch. Slowly he straightened, his cheek reddened but his expression calm. You, he said quietly, his voice steady and deliberate, just made the biggest mistake of your career. Victoria staggered back, her hand trembling as it fell to her side. Her face drained of color as the reality of what she'd just done settled in. Passengers began murmuring loudly. A man in the row ahead pulled out his phone, his camera pointed toward the unfolding drama. Across the aisle, a young girl whispered to her mother, "Why did she hit him?" Dominic reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen lit up with a notification. The finalization of SkyLuxe Airlines' acquisition was confirmed. With a measured breath, he slid the phone back into his pocket. He wasn't just another passenger, he was the owner of the airline. Victoria's chest heaved as she struggled to regain her composure. Her carefully curated professionalism had crumbled in an instant. The eyes of the cabin bore down on her, some with disbelief, others with judgment. Dominic's calmness, by contrast, was unnerving. I trust you'll take a moment to reflect on your actions, he said, his voice carrying just enough weight to deepen the pit forming in her stomach. Sir, she began, her voice shaky, I can explain. No need, Dominic interrupted, raising a hand. Your actions have explained enough. Victoria's lips parted as if to argue, but the intensity of his gaze silenced her. The cabin crew, alerted by the escalating whispers, arrived in a flurry. Is everything all right here? Asked one of the junior flight attendants, her eyes darting nervously between Victoria and Dominic. Dominic nodded. Everything is fine for now, he said. I'd like to settle in and enjoy the flight. The junior attendant hesitated, but nodded, retreating. Victoria stood frozen, her mind racing. She felt the weight of Dominic's parting words as he finally leaned back in his seat, reaching for the in-flight magazine with an air of unnerving composure. Across the cabin, the tension was palpable. One man leaned toward his companion and whispered, Who do you think he is? I don't know, she replied, but that woman's career is over. Dominic closed his eyes momentarily, letting the hum of the engines drown out the chaos around him. He wasn't angry. No, this was something else. A sense of clarity, a moment where he realized that this wasn't just about him. This incident was a symptom of something deeper, a cultural rot within the very company he had built. As the plane began its ascent, Dominic opened his eyes and looked out at the horizon. This wasn't just a moment of humiliation. It was an opportunity for change. Dominic Hughes sat in the corner of his office at SkyLuxe Airlines Seattle headquarters, his chair angled to face the sprawling city skyline. The gleaming towers reflected the morning sunlight, a stark contrast to the weight of the decision that loomed over him. The slap still echoed in his memory, not for the sting it had left on his cheek, but for what it revealed about the company he had built. SkyLuxe Airlines had been his pride, a symbol of possibility for people like him, once underestimated, now leading. But that incident wasn't just about one person's bias. It spoke to something deeper, systemic. something festering beneath the polished veneer of his airline. Dominic turned his phone over in his hands. He had watched videos passengers posted from the flight, the slap, the murmurs of disbelief, the judgmental looks. All of it had gone viral overnight. The incident wasn't just about Victoria Lane anymore. It was about what SkyLuxe represented to the world, and right now, that image was tarnished. Dominic leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. He couldn't afford a knee-jerk reaction, not with so much at stake. Dismissing Victoria outright might satisfy public outrage, but it wouldn't address the root issue. Systemic problems require systemic solutions, he murmured to himself. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Naomi Grant, SkyLuxe's head of HR, entered. Her tailored suit and firm expression spoke of a woman who had weathered storms before, though the tension in her shoulders suggested she was bracing for another. "Morning, Dominic," she said, her voice professional but warm. "I've reviewed the passenger and crew statements from the flight. It's troubling, to say the least." Dominic gestured for her to sit. "Troubling doesn't begin to cover it," he said. "This isn't just about Victoria. Her actions are the symptom. The disease runs much deeper." Naomi nodded, placing a folder on his desk. "There's a pattern," she admitted. "We've had previous complaints about similar behavior, dismissive attitudes, discriminatory practices, but they've been brushed aside as one-offs. That ends today." Dominic opened the folder, scanning the reports. His jaw tightened as he read testimony after testimony of passengers being judged by appearance, staff dismissing concerns, and a lack of accountability at every level. "This isn't who we are," Dominic said firmly, closing the folder, "and it's my responsibility to fix it." Hours later, Victoria Lane stood outside Dominic's office, her polished exterior masking the storm inside her. She had barely slept since the flight, the events replaying in her mind like a nightmare she couldn't escape. The news had spread quickly among the staff. Some colleagues offered sympathetic smiles. Others avoided her entirely. She felt like a pariah, her once pristine reputation shattered. "Mr. Hughes will see you now," Naomi said, her tone neutral. Victoria stepped inside, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. Dominic was seated at his desk, the weight of authority radiating from him, despite his calm demeanor. "Ms. Lane," he began, gesturing to the chair across from him. Victoria sat, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. "Mr. Hughes," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to—" Dominic held up a hand, silencing her. "Before you speak, I want to make something clear," he said, his tone steady. "This isn't about you as an individual. It's about what your actions represent. Do you understand that?" Victoria swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes, sir." Dominic leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. SkyLuxe Airlines was founded to be more than just another luxury carrier. It was meant to reflect a standard of excellence, not just in service, but in values. What happened on that flight showed me we've failed in that mission. "I know I messed up," Victoria said, her voice trembling. "I was wrong, and I'm deeply sorry." "Sorry isn't enough," Dominic replied bluntly. "Not for what you did, and not for what it represents." Victoria flinched at the words, but didn't look away. Dominic slid a paper across the desk toward her, a formal termination notice. "As of today, you are no longer employed by SkyLuxe Airlines," he said. "Your actions leave me no choice. You violated not just the trust of our passengers, but the principles this company stands for." Victoria stared at the document, her vision blurring as tears welled in her eyes. She had known this was coming, but hearing the words still felt like a blow. "I understand," she said finally, her voice choked with emotion. "And I don't blame you. What I did, it was indefensible." Dominic studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Do you know why I started SkyLuxe?" he asked. Victoria shook her head. "My mother," Dominic said. "She worked as a housekeeper for wealthy families, people who treated her like she was invisible. I built this airline to challenge that, to show that excellence isn't about appearance or privilege, it's about how we treat each other." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Victoria's tears spilled over. "I see that now," she whispered, "and I'll carry this lesson with me for the rest of my life." She stood, clutching the termination letter. "Thank you," she said, her voice steadier now, "for giving me a chance to learn, even if I didn't deserve it." As she turned to leave, Dominic called out, "Victoria." She stopped, looking back at him. "Sometimes," he said, "a mistake can be the start of something better, but only if you're willing to change." Victoria nodded, her heart heavy, but filled with a sliver of hope. As the door closed behind her, Dominic leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. Terminating Victoria hadn't been easy, but it was necessary. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of the work ahead. He pressed a button on his desk, summoning Naomi. "I want a full review of our hiring practices, training programs, and employee evaluations," he said when she entered. "Every gap, every oversight, I want it identified and fixed." "Understood," Naomi replied. "And one more thing," Dominic added. "I want a cultural transformation plan drafted by the end of the week. SkyLuxe will set the standard, not just for service, but for humanity." Naomi nodded, leaving the room with purpose. Dominic turned back to the skyline, the sun setting over the city. Change wouldn't be easy, but he was ready. Victoria Lane sat in her apartment, staring blankly at the termination letter. It had been 2 days since she'd stood in Dominic Hughes' office and heard those fateful words. "You are no longer employed by SkyLuxe Airlines." Her meticulously decorated apartment now felt empty, cold even. The framed certificates on the wall, the polished service awards, and the sleek uniform hanging in her closet, all of it mocked her. She had built her identity around being a model employee, a paragon of professionalism in an industry that demanded perfection. Now, it had all crumbled because of a moment of arrogance and impulsive rage. Victoria knew she deserved it. She had replayed the slap in her mind more times than she could count, each replay hitting her harder than the last. She couldn't believe she had done something so unprofessional, so utterly reckless. But it wasn't just the slap. It was everything that had led to it. "I judged him," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "I assumed the worst because of how he looked." Tears welled in her eyes as she picked up the photo on her desk. It was of her parents, beaming with pride on the day she had been promoted to chief flight attendant. Her father's words from that day echoed in her mind. "You've worked so hard for this, Victoria. Never forget where you came from, but always treat others with respect, no matter where they come from." She had failed him. Victoria paced her apartment, the letter clutched tightly in her hand. She couldn't let it end like this. She didn't expect forgiveness, but she couldn't leave SkyLuxe without at least trying to set things right. The next morning, Victoria dressed in a simple blouse and skirt, far removed from her usual polished uniform. She drove to SkyLuxe headquarters in silence, her stomach churning with nerves. When she reached the receptionist's desk, she hesitated, her heart pounding. "I'm here to see Mr. Hughes," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. The receptionist looked up, her expression neutral. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Victoria admitted, "but it's important." After a pause, the receptionist made a call. Minutes later, she nodded. "You can go in," she said, motioning toward Dominic's office. Victoria stepped into Dominic Hughes' office, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. He was seated at his desk, reviewing a stack of documents. The sunlight streaming through the large windows cast him in a warm, almost intimidating glow. "Ms. Lane," he said, glancing up. "I wasn't expecting you." "I know," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I couldn't leave without saying thank you." Dominic raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "Thank me?" Victoria nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "You were right to fire me. I deserved it. What I did to you, and to others over the years, was wrong. I was blinded by my own biases and arrogance. But because of this, I've realized how much I need to change. I needed this wake-up call." She paused, taking a deep breath. "I grew up in a small town where everyone looked and thought the same. Diversity wasn't something we talked about. And when I joined SkyLuxe, I carried those blinders with me. I let them dictate how I treated people, and for that, I'm deeply sorry." Dominic studied her, his expression unreadable. "I know my apology doesn't change what I did," Victoria continued, "but I want you to know that I'm going to take this lesson to heart. I'll work on myself. I'll be better, not just in my career, but as a person." For a moment, Dominic said nothing. Then he stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "You know," he began, his voice calm, "I didn't want to fire you, Not because you didn't deserve it, but because I believe people can change, if they're willing to. Victoria's eyes widened slightly, but she stayed silent. Dominic turned to face her. What you did was unacceptable, Victoria, but I also see something in you that I don't see often, genuine remorse, and that's the first step toward growth. He paused, his gaze piercing. Tell me, do you believe you can change? Yes, Victoria said immediately. I know it won't be easy, but I'm willing to do the work. Dominic walked back to his desk and picked up a folder. He opened it, revealing her termination letter. After a moment, he slid it aside. Here's what I'm going to do, he said. I'm reinstating you under probation. You'll undergo mandatory training, cultural sensitivity, leadership development, the works. You'll be evaluated regularly, and your actions will determine whether you stay with this company. Do you accept those terms? Victoria stared at him, stunned. You're giving me a second chance? I am, Dominic said. But this isn't about wiping the slate clean. This is about earning back trust, mine, your colleagues, and our passengers. Tears streamed down Victoria's face as she nodded. I accept. Thank you. Thank you so much. As Victoria left Dominic's office, a sense of hope she hadn't felt in days bloomed in her chest. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. Meanwhile, Dominic sat back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. He knew he was taking a risk, but he believed in second chances. And something about Victoria's sincerity gave him hope that she could become part of the solution, not just a reminder of the problem. As the door closed behind her, Dominic reached for his phone. He had a vision for SkyLuxe, one that didn't just involve improved service, but a transformation of the company's culture. And Victoria Lane might just be the first step in that journey. Victoria Lane adjusted the strap of her bag nervously as she approached the entrance to the SkyLuxe training facility. The sleek, modern building was a stark contrast to the storm of emotions raging within her. She had been reinstated just a week ago, but the conditions of her return were clear. She was to complete an intensive cultural sensitivity and leadership program. Standing outside the glass doors, she took a deep breath, steadying herself. She knew this wasn't going to be easy. Change never is, she reminded herself as she stepped inside. The lobby was bustling with activity. A diverse mix of employees, pilots, flight attendants, and ground crew filled the space, their conversations punctuated by the click of keyboards and the shuffle of papers. Victoria felt their eyes on her as she made her way to the front desk. I'm here for the training program, she said softly to the receptionist. Name? Victoria Lane. The receptionist's smile faltered for a split second before she handed over a badge and a packet of materials. Room 203, she said, her voice polite but distant. Victoria nodded, clutching the materials tightly as she made her way to the room. The training room was bright and airy, with rows of circular tables designed to foster collaboration. Victoria chose a seat near the back, trying to avoid drawing attention to herself. Slowly, the other participants trickled in, filling the room with murmurs and laughter. When the instructor, Meena Patel, walked in, the room fell silent. Meena was a small woman with a commanding presence, her bright scarf a splash of color against her neutral attire. She smiled warmly as she addressed the group. Welcome to the SkyLuxe Cultural Sensitivity and Leadership Program, she began. This isn't just about learning new policies. It's about unlearning biases, opening your mind and becoming better versions of yourselves, not just as employees, but as people. Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Meena's gaze swept the room, pausing briefly on Victoria. This will be challenging, she continued. You'll need to reflect deeply on your experiences, your assumptions, and how they shape the way you interact with the world. Are you ready? A few murmured affirmations rose from the group. Victoria remained silent. The first exercise was deceptively simple. Each participant was handed a worksheet with questions designed to probe their personal beliefs. What assumptions do you make about people based on their appearance? How do your cultural experiences influence your behavior? Have you ever treated someone unfairly because of a bias you didn't realize you had? Victoria stared at the questions, her chest tightening. Memories of her hometown surfaced unbidden. The homogeneous faces, the narrow conversations, the unspoken rules about who belonged. She thought of Dominic Hughes and the slap that had upended her life. Taking a deep breath, she picked up her pen and began writing. The next few weeks were grueling. Each day began with introspective exercises, followed by group discussions. Victoria found herself facing uncomfortable truths about her past, how her upbringing in a small, insular community had shaped her biases, how her drive for perfectionism had blinded her to the humanity of others. In one session, participants were asked to share a moment they regretted, a time when they had failed to treat someone with respect. Victoria hesitated as the room fell silent, all eyes on her. She had avoided sharing much about her past, but she knew this moment was important. "I judged someone," she said finally, her voice shaky. "I assumed he didn't belong because he didn't fit the image I had in my head. And when he didn't respond the way I expected, I escalated the situation, until I did something I'll regret for the rest of my life." The room was quiet as she finished. Mina nodded thoughtfully. "Acknowledging our mistakes is the first step toward growth," she said. "But the real work is in what we do next." Outside the training room, Victoria faced a different challenge. Some of her colleagues had heard about the incident and weren't shy about voicing their opinions. "Why is she even here?" one whispered as she passed by. "Probably just a PR move," another said. "I don't buy it." The words stung, but Victoria refused to let them derail her. Instead, she focused on proving herself through her actions. She volunteered for the most challenging group exercises, participated actively in discussions, and stayed late to review materials. Slowly, she began to win over a few skeptics. One afternoon, during a particularly heated group debate, a fellow participant named Marcus, who had been one of her harshest critics, spoke up. "You know," he said, his tone grudgingly respectful, "I wasn't sure about you at first, but I've been watching and I think you're serious about this." Victoria blinked, surprised. "Thank you," she said quietly. "It doesn't mean you're off the hook," Marcus added with a smirk. "But it's a start." Victoria smiled faintly, feeling a small but significant weight lift from her shoulders. As the weeks went on, Victoria began to notice changes in herself. She listened more carefully, approached conversations with an open mind, and started to see people not as categories, but as individuals with unique stories. For the first time, she felt like she was becoming the kind of person she had always aspired to be, not just a polished professional, but someone who truly valued others. Victoria Lane walked into the training room early one morning, the air still carrying the faint chill of dawn. She had arrived 30 minutes before the session started, eager to prepare for the day's exercises. What she didn't expect was to find Dominic Hughes already there, seated in the corner with a cup of coffee and a tablet in his hand. "Mr. Hughes," Victoria said, startled. Dominic looked up, his calm gaze meeting hers. "Good morning, Ms. Lane. You're early." "I wanted to review the materials before we started," she replied, clutching her folder nervously. Dominic gestured to the seat across from him. "Join me for a moment." Victoria hesitated but sat down, her nerves prickling under his steady gaze. "How's the program going?" he asked. "It's intense," she admitted, "but necessary. I've learned a lot about myself and about what I need to change." Dominic nodded. "Good, that's the point. Growth isn't supposed to be comfortable." He paused, leaning back slightly. "I wanted to share something with you," he said, his tone softer now. Victoria's curiosity piqued as he began. "When I was a young man," Dominic started, "I worked as a porter in a small hotel. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. I'd carry suitcases, clean up messes, and do whatever was needed to keep the guests happy." He sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "One day, a man checked in, a wealthy businessman. He didn't even look at me when I greeted him. When I offered to carry his bags, he waved me off like I was invisible." Victoria frowned, but Dominic's expression remained calm. Later, I overheard him complaining to the manager about unprofessional staff. I hadn't done anything wrong, but to him, I wasn't worthy of respect because of what I looked like, or maybe because of the job I was doing. Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but Dominic held up a hand. "That moment stayed with me," he continued. "Not because it hurt, I'd faced worse, but because it taught me something important. People's assumptions can be as damaging as their actions. And if we don't challenge those assumptions, we let them fester." He leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "You've faced your assumptions, Victoria. That's a good start. But now, it's about what you do with what you've learned. Do you understand?" Victoria nodded, her throat tight. "Yes, sir." Dominic's mentorship became a turning point for Victoria. Over the next several weeks, he made time to meet with her after training sessions, offering guidance and sharing insights from his own experiences. One evening, after a particularly challenging group exercise, Dominic called her to his office. "You did well today," he said as she entered. "Thank you," she replied, though her exhaustion was evident. "But," Dominic continued, "I noticed you hesitated when Marcus brought up systemic bias. Why?" Victoria shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't want to say the wrong thing," she admitted. Dominic smiled faintly. Silence can be as harmful as the wrong words. Sometimes the only way to learn is to speak up and be willing to be corrected. His words stayed with her. As Victoria applied herself, she began to see subtle changes in how her colleagues treated her. Those who had been skeptical at first started to acknowledge her efforts. During a team workshop, Marcus, her former critic, spoke up. "I'll be honest," he said, glancing at Victoria. "When you first came back, I didn't think you'd take this seriously, but you've proven me wrong." Victoria felt a wave of gratitude but kept her response simple. "Thank you. That means a lot." The breakthrough came during a role-playing exercise designed to simulate difficult customer interactions. Victoria was paired with a trainee who played the role of a passenger feeling unfairly treated. At the end of the exercise, the trainee looked at her and said, "You really listened to me. I felt seen." For Victoria, it was a moment of clarity. She realized that empathy wasn't just a skill, it was a choice, one she had to make every day. One afternoon, as Victoria wrapped up a session, Dominic approached her with a rare smile. "I think you're ready for the next step," he said. Victoria's brows furrowed. "The next step?" Dominic nodded. "I want you to start leading some of these workshops. Share your story, your journey. It's one thing to learn, it's another to teach." Victoria hesitated. "What if I'm not ready?" "You are," Dominic said firmly. "And the best way to prove it is by helping others grow." Victoria's first workshop was nerve-wracking, but it turned out to be a turning point. As she stood in front of her colleagues, sharing her story and the lessons she had learned, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't known before. By the end of the session, several participants approached her, thanking her for her honesty and courage. "You're inspiring," one colleague said. "You've made me think about my own biases in a way I never have before." Victoria felt a swell of pride, not in herself, but in the progress she had made and the impact it was having on others. Weeks later, Dominic invited her to his office for a final review. "You've exceeded my expectations," he said. "But remember, the journey doesn't end here. Growth is a lifelong process." Victoria smiled, her gratitude evident. "Thank you for believing in me, Mr. Hughes. I won't let you down." Dominic nodded. "I know you won't. Now go out there and keep making a difference." Victoria Lane adjusted the microphone clipped to her blazer and took a deep breath. The conference room at SkyLuxe headquarters was filled with employees, flight attendants, ground crew, and even mid-level executives. They had gathered for her first workshop on empathy and cultural sensitivity. A few months ago, she wouldn't have imagined herself here. The thought of speaking openly about her mistakes would have paralyzed her. Now, as she stood before the expectant crowd, she felt a mix of nervousness and determination. Dominic Hughes was seated near the back, his calm expression giving her a small sense of reassurance. He had encouraged her to lead these sessions, insisting that sharing her journey would be more powerful than any policy memo. Victoria stepped to the podium, her heart pounding. She glanced at the crowd, taking in their curious, skeptical, and even indifferent expressions. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady but soft. "Before we get started, I want to tell you a story. My story." Victoria paused, letting the room settle before continuing. "Not long ago, I was sitting where you are now," she said. "I thought I was doing everything right. I thought I was the model employee. But then, something happened that forced me to take a hard look at myself." She hesitated, the memory of that moment flashing vividly in her mind. The slap, the stunned silence, Dominic's calm but cutting words. "On a flight, I made a terrible mistake," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "I judged a passenger, not because of anything he said or did, but because of how he looked. And when he didn't fit my expectations, I escalated the situation in a way that was completely unprofessional." The room was silent, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. The passenger I wronged was Mr. Dominic Hughes, she continued, gesturing toward the back of the room. The founder of this airline, the man who built SkyLuxe to be a place of inclusion, excellence, and respect, and I failed to embody those values. She saw a ripple of surprise move through the crowd as they connected the dots. That experience humbled me, Victoria said, her voice steadying. It made me realize that I had biases I wasn't even aware of, and it made me commit to changing, not just for myself, but for the people I serve and work with every day. Victoria's honesty set the tone for the rest of the workshop. She led the group through exercises designed to challenge their assumptions and encourage empathy. One activity involved participants pairing up and sharing a time when they felt judged unfairly. Now, Victoria said, addressing the room, I want you to think about how those moments shaped you, how they made you feel, and then ask yourself, have you ever made someone else feel that way? The room buzzed with quiet conversations as employees reflected and shared their stories. Victoria moved between groups, listening and offering gentle guidance. When the session ended, several participants approached her. Thank you for sharing your story, one flight attendant said. It made me realize I've been holding on to some biases of my own. I never thought about how my assumptions could affect my interactions with passengers, another admitted. You've given me a lot to think about. Victoria smiled, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility. Beyond leading workshops, Victoria threw herself into reform efforts at SkyLuxe. Working closely with HR and Dominic's leadership team, she helped implement changes designed to foster inclusivity and accountability. One of her first initiatives was an anonymous feedback system. We need a way for passengers and employees to voice their concerns without fear of retaliation, Victoria explained during a meeting. It's not just about identifying problems, it's about showing people that their voices matter. The system allowed passengers to rate their experiences and provide detailed feedback. Employees could also submit concerns about workplace behavior or suggest improvements. The response was immediate. Within weeks, SkyLuxe began receiving valuable insights from both passengers and staff. Victoria worked tirelessly to analyze the data, identifying patterns and proposing solutions. She also championed team-building exercises that encouraged employees from different departments to collaborate and build trust. These aren't just icebreakers, Victoria said during a planning session. They're opportunities to break down barriers and learn from each other's perspectives. The exercises were a hit, fostering camaraderie and mutual respect among employees. Victoria's dedication didn't go unnoticed. Colleagues who had initially doubted her sincerity began to see her commitment. She's not just going through the motions, Marcus said during a break. She's putting in the work, and it's making a difference. Passengers, too, began to notice the changes. Victoria made it a point to interact personally with travelers, listening to their concerns and addressing their needs with genuine care. During one flight, an elderly woman approached her with a timid smile. "Thank you for helping me earlier," the woman said. "It's been a long time since I've felt treated with such kindness." Victoria felt a lump in her throat as she replied, "It's my pleasure, ma'am. Everyone deserves to feel valued." These moments, small as they seemed, reinforced her sense of purpose. Months into her new role, Victoria stood before a room of SkyLuxe executives to present the results of the reforms she had helped implement. Since launching the feedback system, passenger satisfaction scores have increased by 15%, she reported. We've also seen a 20% decrease in employee complaints related to workplace bias. The room broke into applause, and Dominic smiled from his seat at the head of the table. "Impressive work," he said. "But more importantly, how do you feel about the progress we've made?" Victoria paused, her mind racing through the journey that had brought her here. "I think we've taken meaningful steps," she said, "but there's still more work to do. Change doesn't happen overnight. It's a process, and I'm committed to seeing it through." Dominic nodded. "That's the kind of leadership we need." As Victoria left the meeting, she reflected on how far she had come. She had started this journey burdened by guilt and shame, unsure if she could ever redeem herself. Now, she was part of a movement that was transforming SkyLuxe into a model of inclusivity and respect. Her redemption wasn't just about earning back trust. It was about proving to herself that she could be the kind of leader she had always aspired to be. Victoria Lane sat at her desk, poring over the final details of an employee development program she had been spearheading. It was late in the evening, and most of the office had emptied hours ago. She had thrown herself into her work ever since being given a second chance, determined to repay Dominic Hughes' faith in her. The quiet hum of the office was broken by the sudden buzz of her phone. It was an email, brief but startling. "Meet me in my office tomorrow morning. Dominic?" Victoria's heart raced. She had no idea what the meeting was about, but she felt a twinge of unease. Had she overlooked something? Had she failed to meet expectations? The next morning, Victoria walked into Dominic's office, her nerves barely hidden beneath a calm exterior. Dominic stood near his window, hands in his pockets, staring out at the bustling airport below. "Victoria," he said, turning to face her. "Come in." She stepped forward, her palms slightly damp. Dominic gestured for her to sit, but he didn't return to his chair immediately. Instead, he leaned against the edge of his desk, folding his arms. "I've been thinking about the journey you've been on these past few months," he began. "When I gave you a second chance, I wasn't sure what to expect. But you've exceeded every expectation, not just in the work you've done, but in the person you've become." Victoria opened her mouth to speak, but Dominic raised a hand to stop her. "You've proven you can lead by example," he continued. "And now, I want you to take that leadership to the next level." Dominic straightened and pulled a document from his desk. He handed it to Victoria. At the top of the page, in bold letters, were the words, "Director of Cultural Development." Her breath caught. "This is my vision for the future of SkyLuxe," Dominic said, "and I can't think of anyone better suited for the job than you." Victoria stared at the document, her mind racing. The title, the responsibilities. It was more than she had ever imagined. I don't know if I'm ready for this," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic smiled faintly. "You are, and if you're not, you'll learn, just as you have every step of the way." Victoria swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing on her. "Thank you," she said, her voice steadying. "I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Dominic replied. The announcement of Victoria's promotion rippled through SkyLuxe like a wave. To some, it was a surprise. To others, it was a vindication of the progress she had made. Victoria's first major assignment as Director of Cultural Development came quickly. A team member flagged an issue with a long-standing employee who had a reputation for dismissive behavior toward passengers. It was a delicate situation, requiring tact and firmness. Victoria met with the employee personally, listening carefully as they defended their actions. Then, she shared her own story. "I know what it's like to make assumptions," she said. "I know how easy it is to fall into patterns without realizing the harm we're causing. But I also know that change is possible if we're willing to confront those patterns." The employee's expression softened. By the end of the conversation, they agreed to participate in additional training, and Victoria felt a small but significant sense of victory. A few weeks later, Victoria faced a new challenge, the annual Aviation Summit, where industry leaders gathered to discuss the future of air travel. SkyLuxe had been invited to speak about its transformation, and Dominic insisted that Victoria take the stage. "People need to hear your story," he said, "not just because it's powerful, but because it's proof that change starts with accountability." Standing in front of an audience of hundreds, Victoria felt the weight of their eyes on her. She took a deep breath and began. "I'm here today because someone gave me a second chance," she said. "But that chance came with a responsibility to confront my biases, to change my behavior, and to help others do the same." Her words resonated deeply. By the end of her speech, the audience rose in applause, and several attendees approached her afterward to share their own stories of transformation. Under Victoria's leadership, SkyLuxe Airlines continued to evolve. She worked closely with Dominic and other executives to ensure that inclusivity wasn't just a buzzword, but a core part of the company's identity. The reforms she championed, anonymous feedback systems, mentorship programs, and team-building initiatives, became models for the industry. Competitors took notice, and soon other airlines were adopting similar measures. But it wasn't just about policies. Victoria made a point of being visible, approachable. She regularly visited airports and attended employee meetings, listening to concerns and celebrating successes. During one visit, a young flight attendant pulled her aside. "Ms. Lane," she said shyly, "I just wanted to say thank you. Knowing your story, it gives me hope. It makes me believe I can make a difference too." Victoria smiled warmly. "You already are," she said. Months later, Dominic invited Victoria to his office for one of their regular check-ins. He poured them both coffee and leaned back in his chair, a rare moment of relaxation for the usually intense leader. "You've done extraordinary work, Victoria," he said. "When I think about where we started and where we are now, I can't help but feel proud." Victoria felt a lump in her throat. "Thank you, Dominic, for everything, for giving me a chance when I didn't deserve it, for believing in me, and for guiding me through this." Dominic waved a hand dismissively. "You earned this. I just gave you the nudge." As Victoria left Dominic's office, she paused to take in the view from the corridor window. Below, SkyLuxe planes were being prepared for their next journeys, their sleek designs a testament to the company's commitment to excellence. Victoria knew there was still work to be done, but for the first time in her life, she felt truly at peace with who she was and what she had accomplished. SkyLuxe wasn't just a better airline, it was a better place for everyone who worked and traveled within it. And Victoria Lane was proud to be part of that legacy. The grand hall of SkyLuxe Airlines headquarters buzzed with anticipation. Employees, industry leaders, and invited guests filled the space, their conversations creating a lively hum under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. This event marked a significant milestone in the company's history, a celebration of transformation, unity, and hope. At the center of it all stood Dominic Wren, the man who had redefined what it meant to lead with purpose and vision. His tailored suit and calm demeanor exuded confidence, but his eyes carried a quiet warmth. As he stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent, the weight of expectation settling over the audience. "Good evening, everyone," Dominic began, his voice steady but infused with emotion. "Tonight, we celebrate more than just the success of SkyLuxe Airlines. We celebrate the power of growth, the courage to change, and the resilience of the human spirit." He paused, letting his words resonate before continuing. "A year ago, we faced challenges, not just operational, but cultural. Our company, like many others, struggled with biases that threatened to erode the very values we claim to uphold. But it is in times of difficulty that we find opportunities to grow." Dominic's gaze swept over the crowd, searching for one particular face. When he found her, standing quietly near the edge of the room, he smiled. "Tonight, I want to share a story about one of our own, a story of redemption and transformation." The spotlight shifted to Victoria Hale, standing frozen in surprise. Dressed elegantly in a navy blue gown, she looked every bit the professional she had become, but her trembling hands betrayed her nervousness. Dominic gestured for her to join him on stage. Reluctantly, she stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The audience erupted into applause, some recognizing her story, others simply moved by the moment. "Victoria Hale," Dominic continued once the applause subsided, "represents what it means to learn from our mistakes. Her journey is one of introspection, determination, and ultimately, transformation. She reminded us all that change is not just possible, it is essential." Victoria's cheeks burned as she took the microphone Dominic offered her. She hesitated, glancing at the sea of faces before her. "Thank you," she began, her voice barely audible. "Thank you, Dominic, for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. Thank you for giving me a second chance, not just to rebuild my career, but to rebuild who I am as a person." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "When I made that mistake on the flight, I thought it would define me forever. But Dominic saw something in me I couldn't see in myself, a capacity to change. And that belief has made all the difference." The room erupted into applause once more, this time louder, more heartfelt. Victoria stepped back, tears glistening in her eyes as Dominic took the microphone again. "As a leader," Dominic said, his voice filled with conviction, "it's not just about driving profits or expanding operations. It's about nurturing people, giving them the tools to grow, to confront their biases, and to create a better world. And Victoria has done just that." He gestured toward a large screen behind him, where a montage of Victoria's journey played, a visual testament to her transformation. From her initial training sessions to leading workshops and mentoring colleagues, the images told a story of redemption and hope. The applause swelled as the video ended, many in the audience visibly moved. Dominic turned to Victoria, a genuine smile lighting his face. You have not only redeemed yourself, but inspired us all. Thank you for proving that second chances can lead to extraordinary outcomes. As the crowd rose to their feet in a standing ovation, Victoria felt a swell of pride and gratitude, unlike anything she had ever experienced. For the first time in her life, she truly believed she belonged. The SkyLuxe Annual Excellence Gala was always a grand affair, but this year felt different. The event hall buzzed with anticipation, filled with employees from every level of the company. Flight attendants in their polished uniforms mingled with executives in tailored suits, while soft music played in the background. Victoria Lane stood off to the side, adjusting the hem of her evening dress. Though she had attended the gala before, this year carried a special weight. She had been told there would be a segment celebrating the company's cultural transformation, a transformation she had played a pivotal role in, but she had no idea how central she was to the evening's agenda. At the front of the room, Dominic Hughes took the stage. His presence commanded attention, and the hum of conversation quieted almost instantly. He looked out over the crowd, his gaze steady but warm. "Good evening, everyone," he began. "Tonight, we celebrate not just our achievements, but the people who make them possible. SkyLuxe has always been more than an airline. It's a family, built on the values of respect, empathy, and excellence." Victoria felt a pang of emotion as his words resonated deeply within her. Dominic's tone shifted slightly, growing more reflective. "Change is never easy," he said, "but it is necessary. A year ago, we faced a challenge, one that forced us to look inward and ask ourselves some difficult questions. Who are we as a company? What do we stand for? And how can we do better?" He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the audience. At the center of that challenge was one person, someone who made a mistake, but instead of running from it, chose to face it. Someone who turned a moment of reckoning into a journey of redemption and growth. Victoria's heart raced as she realized he was talking about her. "This person didn't just change themselves," Dominic continued. "They changed us. Their courage, humility, and determination have set a standard for what it means to be a leader at SkyLuxe. And tonight, we recognize their contributions, not just to this company, but to the culture we're building together." He gestured toward the side of the stage. "Victoria Lane, please join me." The room erupted in applause as Victoria's breath caught. She hadn't expected this, hadn't prepared for it. Slowly, she made her way to the stage, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. When she reached Dominic, he extended a hand, guiding her to the microphone. "Victoria," he said, his voice steady but full of warmth, "your journey has been nothing short of extraordinary, and tonight we celebrate not just your achievements, but the example you've set for all of us." Victoria blinked back tears as Dominic handed her the microphone. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Thank you," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know how to put into words what this moment means to me." The room fell silent as she continued. "A year ago, I made a mistake that could have defined me," she said. "But instead, it became the catalyst for change, not just in my life, but in how I see the world. That wouldn't have been possible without the support of this company, and especially without the guidance of Mr. Hughes." She glanced at Dominic, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. "I've learned that redemption isn't about erasing the past," she said, her voice gaining strength. "It's about owning it, learning from it, and using it to create something better. And I'm so grateful to be part of a company that believes in second chances and the power of growth." As she stepped back, the room erupted into a standing ovation. Tears blurred Victoria's vision as she looked out over the crowd, overwhelmed by the moment. Dominic took the microphone again, his expression thoughtful. "Victoria's story reminds us of something important," he said, "that no one is perfect, but everyone is capable of growth, that when we choose to believe in people, in their potential, in their ability to change, we create something extraordinary." He turned toward Victoria, his voice soft but firm. "You've shown us what true leadership looks like, and for that, we thank you." The applause rose again, louder this time, filling the hall with a palpable sense of unity and hope. Victoria stepped off the stage, her heart full. She had come full circle, from a moment of failure to a place of redemption. And now, she was ready to continue building the legacy of change she had started. The applause from the gala lingered in Dominic Hughes's mind as he sat alone in his office later that evening. The room was quiet now, the buzz of celebration replaced by the soft hum of the city outside. A faint smile played on his lips as he swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the glow of the skyline reflecting in his eyes. The day had been a milestone for SkyLuxe Airlines, a testament to the transformation they had undergone over the past year. But for Dominic, it was more than just a corporate achievement. It was personal. Dominic leaned back in his chair, his thoughts drifting to the moment he had decided to give Victoria Lane a second chance. He had been furious on that flight, humiliated and disappointed by her behavior. It would have been easy, almost expected, to fire her on the spot and move on. But something had stopped him. Dominic had seen the flicker of remorse in Victoria's eyes that day, the same look he'd once seen in his own reflection years ago. He remembered a time when he had made a mistake in his early career, a careless error that had nearly cost him everything. A mentor had stepped in, offering not just correction, but guidance. It was that second chance that had set him on the path to becoming the man he was today. If no one had believed in me then, he muttered to himself, I wouldn't be here now. It was that memory that had compelled him to take a risk on Victoria, and tonight, as he watched her stand before the company and share her journey, he knew he had made the right choice. Dominic turned his chair to face the large window, his eyes scanning the twinkling lights of the city below. SkyLuxe's transformation hadn't been easy. It had required confronting uncomfortable truths, breaking old habits, and rebuilding trust at every level of the organization. But it had been worth it. The changes Victoria had championed, anonymous feedback systems, mentorship programs, cultural sensitivity training, hadn't just improved employee morale, they had fundamentally altered the way the company operated. He thought of the letters they had received from passengers, letters thanking SkyLuxe for making them feel respected, valued, and seen. One in particular came to mind. I never thought I'd say this about an airline, the letter had read, but SkyLuxe didn't just get me to my destination. They reminded me that kindness still exists. Dominic's chest tightened at the memory. The ripple effect of Victoria's redemption wasn't confined to the company's walls. It had touched their customers, their communities, and even their competitors. Other airlines had reached out, seeking advice on implementing similar initiatives. SkyLuxe had become a model for what the aviation industry could be. Not just luxurious, but human. Dominic's thoughts returned to the gala, to the sight of Victoria standing on that stage. He had seen the way her colleagues looked at her, with respect, admiration, and even pride. She had earned their trust, not through grand gestures, but through consistent, humble effort. He thought of her speech, of the way she had owned her mistakes and used them as a springboard for growth. It was a powerful reminder of the philosophy he had built SkyLuxe on. People aren't defined by their failures, but by what they do after them. Dominic sipped his drink, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. This was the victory he had hoped for, not just for Victoria, but for the company as a whole. The sound of his office door opening drew Dominic from his thoughts. It was Victoria, her expression hesitant. I hope I'm not interrupting, she said softly. Dominic gestured for her to come in. Not at all. What's on your mind? She stepped forward, her hands clasped nervously. I just wanted to thank you again, she said. For everything, for believing in me when I didn't deserve it. Dominic smiled. You deserved a chance, Victoria, and you made the most of it. That's all anyone can ask. She nodded, a faint smile on her lips. I'm going to keep working hard, for the company, for our team, and for the people we serve. I have no doubt you will, Dominic said. As she turned to leave, Dominic called after her. Victoria. She paused, looking back. You've done something remarkable, he said. Not just for SkyLuxe, but for everyone who's had the privilege of working with you. Never forget that. When the door closed behind her, Dominic leaned back in his chair, a contented sigh escaping him. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every step. Watching Victoria grow, watching the company transform, it was a testament to the power of second chances and the importance of believing in people's capacity for change. Dominic gazed out at the city one last time before turning off his desk lamp. The world outside was constantly moving, constantly changing, and so was SkyLuxe. For Dominic, it was the perfect reminder of why he had started this journey in the first place. to build something better, not just for himself, but for everyone. With that thought, he left the office, the sound of his footsteps fading into the quiet night. The sun streamed through the tall windows of SkyLuxe Airlines headquarters as Victoria Lane stood in her office, gazing out at the bustling airport below. Planes were taxiing on the runways, and passengers moved purposefully through the terminal, their faces a mix of anticipation and excitement. Victoria's heart swelled with pride. She had come so far from the woman who once made snap judgments about people's worth. Now, every decision she made as Director of Cultural Development was rooted in empathy and a genuine desire to make a difference. She turned back to her desk, where a stack of handwritten thank you notes sat. One was from an employee who had attended her workshops, thanking her for giving them the courage to speak up against workplace discrimination. Another was from a passenger who praised SkyLuxe for making their travel experience unforgettable, not because of luxury, but because of kindness. Moments like these reminded Victoria of why she had worked so hard to earn this second chance. She thought about Dominic Hughes, the man who had taken a risk on her when she least deserved it. His faith in her had been the catalyst for her transformation, and she owed much of her growth to his unwavering belief in people's capacity for change. Grabbing her phone, she sent him a quick message. "Thank you for everything. I hope you know how much your guidance has meant to me." A reply came almost instantly. "The credit belongs to you, Victoria. You've done extraordinary work. Keep going." Meanwhile, Dominic Hughes stood in the SkyLuxe terminal, watching passengers board their flights. The atmosphere was calm and organized, with employees greeting travelers warmly and offering assistance with genuine care. Dominic's thoughts drifted to his late mother, who had been the inspiration behind everything he had built. She had been a kind but firm woman, always teaching him the value of treating people with dignity, no matter their circumstances. "Treat others the way you'd want someone to treat me, Dominic," she had often said. Those words had guided him through every challenge, every triumph. And now, as he saw SkyLuxe thriving, not just as a successful business, but as a symbol of inclusivity and respect, he felt he had honored her legacy. Dominic's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a reminder about the evening's gala, where they would celebrate another year of achievements. He smiled, knowing that tonight would be a moment to reflect on how far they had come, and the people who had made it possible. The gala was held in a grand ballroom, its walls draped with elegant fabric and its tables adorned with glittering centerpieces. The room was filled with laughter, applause, and the sound of clinking glasses as SkyLuxe employees and guests mingled. Victoria stood near the stage, chatting with a group of flight attendants who shared stories of how the airline's culture had improved over the past year. She listened intently, her heart glowing with satisfaction. "Victoria," a familiar voice called. She turned to see Dominic approaching, his expression warm. "Mr. Hughes," she greeted with a smile. "You can call me Dominic, you know," he teased gently. Victoria laughed. Old habits die hard. They stood together for a moment, taking in the lively atmosphere. "This is your doing, you know," Dominic said, gesturing to the room. "The changes we've made, the culture we've built, it wouldn't have been possible without you." Victoria shook her head. "I just played a small part. It was your vision that made all of this possible." Dominic smiled. "Maybe, but it was your courage that brought it to life." The sound of a microphone tapping drew their attention to the stage, where an announcer was calling for everyone to take their seats. "Let's celebrate," Dominic said, offering her his arm. As they took their seats, Victoria couldn't help but glance at Dominic, a deep sense of gratitude filling her chest. His belief in second chances had not only transformed her life, but it had also created a ripple effect that touched countless others. Dominic, too, found himself reflecting on the journey they had shared. Giving Victoria a second chance hadn't just been the right decision. It had been a reminder of what he believed in most, the power of compassion and the human capacity for growth. The gala continued with speeches, awards, and celebrations, but for Victoria and Dominic, it was more than just an event. It was a moment that symbolized everything they had worked for, an acknowledgement that redemption and transformation were possible when people chose to believe in each other. As the night came to a close, Victoria and Dominic stood side by side, watching the employees and guests file out of the ballroom. "Thank you," Victoria said softly, her voice filled with emotion. Dominic turned to her, a small smile on his lips. "No, Victoria, Thank you." They exchanged a look of mutual respect and understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had shared and the work that still lay ahead. For SkyLuxe Airlines, this wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of a legacy built on respect, dignity, and the enduring power of second chances. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and open the mind. Until next time, remember, every story has the power to make a difference, yours included.